Hello everybody, welcome to Crafty Soup. My name is Misty. I am here with my monthly makes video where I am inspired by products that exist in the real world and I set about creating my own versions. This helps grow my skills and I get to have fun being artful. We're going to start off a little easy to get you warmed up with some heat embossing. And then we're going to move on to some lettering and drawing skills, and I hope the tips and tricks I share give you the confidence to give it a try. I know I haven't always felt comfortable with these things, but I have learned over time, and it has really grown my artfulness. So let's go ahead and dive in. Throughout the video, I'm going to be recreating these journaling cards, and this one is up first, and I'm going to use some dies and some heat embossing to do this. Now, I have this die set from Concord and Ninth that creates these bowls, and I will link you up to that if you're interested in these specific products. But you can do this with anything, maybe a stack of flowers, or if you have another bowl or pots and pans set, go ahead and use that. I am pulling out a bunch of markers from my stash, trying to color match and test it first on the same paper because paper makes a big difference to these results. In this instance, I am just tracing along some stitching lines that the die presses into the piece. And that is the first tip I have for you, is use what is already there and trace it in order to practice hand control, because that is a good start to learning your own drawing skills. And this is the point where I really like to make clear that I am not an artist, and that is okay. In fact, calling myself an artist is a little overwhelming, so I prefer the term artful. And when you're artful, you can practice, you can try, you can fail, and you can grow. So that is why I like to call myself artful. Now, the next step of this project isn't really a big deal, because if you've already done stamping or heat embossing, then this isn't anything new for you. I guess the couple of points that I want to get across is, one, if you're a scrapbooker and you don't already do these things in your scrapbooks, go for it. Get the supplies that you need and do it, because it is a lot of fun. I really enjoy making things with my hands. And if you're a card maker, this is an easy way to get a layout design for your card so that you can just follow a template and grow your skills in terms of coming up with designs for your cards. Now, here is one small technique that I use over and over again and I love to highlight in my videos, and that is creating your own banners. So with all of my heat embossing done, I did heat emboss a sentiment from that same set, and I'm going to create my own 3D banner. So I'm going to start off making the fishtail clipped ends just like I do for other banners, and then I'm going to set about folding it back on itself and then forward on itself so that it creates more of a 3D banner. And that is another reason why I like to make my own things, because I can give them more texture and depth and dimension than they would otherwise have. Okay, I'm already folding up the first side, but let's talk about this again. Fold it back right at the end of the letters, and then flip it over and then fold it forward again so that fishtail sticks out. Now, this side wasn't sticking out quite as much as I wanted it to, so I'm going to adjust it by folding it at a slightly different spot. And now I have this 3D banner. You can add foam tape behind this to keep it popped up. I'm going to add a little bit of glue to help it sit a little flatter while still adding some texture and dimension. And then the heat embossing and the die cutting here adds just subtle texture and dimension, especially if you like your scrapbooks to be flatter. Then these are good things to add that texture and dimension without the extra bulk. All right, for card number 2, we're going to talk about proportions and seeing those proportions, as well as hand lettering. So you saw that example there, and I have to cut down my papers. I know these cards are 4x6, so that is my base layer there. And then the accent strip at the bottom, I have to cut to be in proportion with what I'm seeing. And that goes for the thin strip as well. I didn't use any math here, I just kind of eyeballed it, and I am satisfied with the results. Is it perfectly in proportion with what I'm seeing? No, but that's okay. This is practice. All right, let's move on to hand lettering. So I'm gonna write the word tasty, and the first thing I do is think about how many letters are in the word and where the middle of the word is gonna be. I find it easier if I start in the middle. That helps me keep my spacing from side to side. Now I'm gonna use the top and the bottom of these tags as the top and bottom lines of my letters so that I don't have to worry about getting the height exactly the same and even. But if you're doing straight lines on something, go ahead and use a ruler and a pencil to give yourself top and bottom lines. And I love to use capital letters because I find it much easier to get that height equal and even. And I'm curving my letters to the curve of this tag, and this is a little more advanced, but if you've had some practice with these kinds of things before or doing straight letters, then you can move on to this next step of doing curved letters. Now that is one layer of my Posca paint pen, which is an acrylic paint pen. I'm going to let that dry, and I will coat it again with a second layer to make it much crisper in color. And I'm tracing those stitched lines around the edge as well. And here is the final result of my hand lettering. Now let's move on to more complicated hand lettering. Now I filmed these segments in a different order than I decided to edit them for teaching purposes. So I will talk about some tips and tricks that I won't necessarily show in this section, but I will show them a little bit later. To get started with this one, I cut my base 4x6 card out of the red paper, and now I am trying to get the proportions of mimicking the kind of chalkboard look with a matte layer behind it, which is in this craft style paper. And like in the first example for that layer, I just kind of eyeballed it to get the proportions. Now I did cut it to easy math numbers because the black layer, I do want to have an even and equal mat all the way around. So that one is 1/4 inch smaller. In the inspiration, the corners are curved, so I'm going to use a punch to do that on both of my layers. Now we got to figure out how to get an arched curve at the top of the layer. And I'm going to start with the back mat because that's going to help inform our front black piece. I thought maybe I could trace a circle, but that curve is too steep. If you have an oval, that might work better. However, I'm going to show you how I just do it by hand in case you don't have anything that would help. I'm going to mark 1/4 inch on either side because that had a little edge to where their curves start and stopped. And then I'm going to make sure I draw a straight line across where those marks are so that I'm coming down an equal amount when I trim off those edges. And you'll see how all of this works as we go through the process. Now, in between those marks, I'm going to find the halfway point, and you will see me right middle down here. And that's going to help with hand drawing an arc. So I like to rest my hand where my wrist is sitting near the middle, and then just from the wrist, move my hand back and forth to create an arc. And I will do the same thing on the other side. And when I stop and look at it, my right side arc has a different steepness to it than my left side arc. So I'm going to pick which one I like better and adjust the other side. And this will not be perfect, but it is going to be good enough for what I am comfortable with. So it's up to you to decide what you are comfortable with. I used to get really annoyed with things being imperfect, and I've learned to get over that because I have made some things that have been super fun despite their imperfections, and the more I get happy with the things I've made, the more I try things and the more my skills grow. So letting go of the perfectionism really does make a difference. Okay, now I don't have to do this again on the top layer. I can just trace what I already have. So I'm lining that up with the top of that black layer. And since it already is matted in size, I don't have to worry about changing the size at all. So I can just trace that up there at the top and cut it out. This process meant that I cut off the curves that I'd put on the top edges. And again, I'm going to trace the curves that I already had from my punch on the bottom edges because now my punch isn't going to reach into these awkward nooks. And then I can just trim those off, and here we go. It is not perfect, but I'm happy with it. As I show you some of the other steps in this process, I just want to say that these smaller shaping and proportion skills will help when we get to the more complicated drawing stuff that we're going to do later in the video. Okay, for this journal card, we're going to do a little more stamping and die cutting in order to add some decoration before we get to our hand lettering. All right, here we go. I glued that die cut bowl down, and an easy thing to add to that is a spoon, which is directly from the inspiration, which is just a line. And I like to add a straight line and then kind of trace evenly around that straight line to help fill in the thickness of the spoon. I added in some of the hearts now to help with my spacing of my letters. Now this is the part where I mentioned I would normally do this step with pencil first and then trace over it. That way I can erase and correct anything that I'm not happy with. However, I have been doing this for a while and I don't feel like I need to do that. You did see me kind of mimic the word kitchen there with my pen, and that helps get my brain situated around how much space I need for each letter. I make sure it looks good, and this again is a step that I take now that I'm comfortable with a lot of these things, so that's kind of the next part of my process. So I was very comfortable just going for it and writing my words right away. I'm adding a few more hearts, and that's going to wrap up this one. With the final example coming up next, I will repeat these steps, so if you need to see it again, don't worry, I've got you covered. But for now, I'm gluing all this together, and that wraps up my third card. So let's move on to this one. I am going to create all of these elements except by die cut a bowl. All right, I want to make that mixer first because that feels like to me it's going to be the hardest. Now, the other thing about this is that I'm going to need to do a lot of drawing and erasing with my pencil in order to get my shape right. And no matter how good you are at that, I feel like you can see that pencil and erasing no matter what. So I want to hide that on the back. Now, if I'm doing the imagery on the back, that means it's going to be facing the opposite direction than on the front. So I'm constantly looking at my image as I draw because that really helps me hone in. And if I'm doing that with a digital image, I can go ahead and flip it with a digital tool so that it is actually showing me the reverse. As I draw, I constantly look at my picture, come back, see what I need to adjust, and I'm looking at all of these things in general shapes. So the top of the mixer is a big, long oval. The base of the mixer is a very skinny oval, and the connection between the top and the bottom is a rectangle, yet that rectangle curves at the top and curves at the bottom. So I'm going to start with basic shapes and then adjust as we go. Now the mixer head isn't a round oval at the top. It kind of flattens out and then gets much flatter at the bottom. So as I trace over my own pencil lines, I am adjusting and smoothing these shapes as I go. You certainly see me doing a lot of fixing and erasing and redrawing so that I can get things where I want to be. Now I thought the base of my mixer was a little too far forward from the mixer itself, plus I didn't get the flatness of the front of the mixer quite how I thought it should be, so I brought that front out a little bit so it's more in line with the bottom. Now if I look back at the image while I'm editing this, that's not actually the case, but you know what, it's okay. I will say it over and over and over again. I am not an artist, but I am artful, which means there will be mistakes. Any artist has to start through this artful practice step before they get to being an artist anyway. So I am in that artful practice step. Here I am adjusting things a little bit more. I realized the bottom of my mixer wasn't really all that flat. It looks like it would wobble. I drew a sketchy line from the back of my mixer to the bottom where I think the base of the mixer should end so that the proportions of those seem more in line with each other. And I do my best to straighten out my bottom line. And then I am satisfied enough with this that I can go ahead and fussy cut it out. If you hate fussy cutting, don't worry, I will show you some drawing I do directly on the background and how to get over seeing all of those pencil lines. For this one, this felt complicated to me, so I wanted to do it this way to help hide as much of my imperfection as possible so that I could get an image that I was satisfied with. Skipping over most of the cutting, I thought the hardest part of this was doing the little metal pieces up here where the mixer body turns into the mixer head, and so I just took it really slow and used my skill of patience to get through that part. And when I flip it over to orient it how it is on the original card, it's looking pretty good. I'm going to add details with pen work so that we can make it look more realistic. Before I do that, I'm going to do some of the other pieces for this because when you are working with art, you have to think about what's in front and what's behind. Oh, look at that piece. That was a measuring cup that's going to go in front of the mixer, which I can't just draw on top of the mixer now. I have to make it a separate piece that I can glue on top, and it was way too small, so I'm having to start all over again. I wanted to leave in some of these mistakes so that you can see the process of trial and error. Now that I have those pieces ready, it is time for the pen work. I've got a fine point black pen, I've got a silver gel pen, and I have got my fine tip Posca acrylic paint pen. And I'm going to use a combination of these three things to do all these details. Now for that handle of the measuring cup, I don't want to have to fussy cut out that handle. I know my background paper is going to be white, so I can cheat it by coloring the cardstock white with my Posca paint pen so it looks like it has a hole in the handle without having to actually cut that out. I will add a little bit of shadowing with my black pen, a little bit of detail with the measuring marks with my black pen, and that will give me enough detail to be satisfied. How many details to add is really a personal choice, so it's going to come up big time with this mixer. I know I want the gears of the mixer to be metallic like in the picture. That's going to add a lot more realism to it so that it looks more like a mixer. I know the band going across the middle of the mixer with the little control knob is a detail that I definitely want to add. And as I show you a little bit of a close-up, I will add even more pen work to this, bringing in some contrast and depth with both the black and the white markers as well. Here I am adding that band to the middle. That is classic to me. I have a KitchenAid mixer in my kitchen, and so I know some of these details that catches my eye every time I use it. So that band and the control knob are definitely what I want to capture. Notice that band has some white and some black on the edges of the band, and those are details I noticed and wanted to capture with my white and black gel pen, including the knob has white in the middle, so I'm going to capture that as well. Now, it also had a whole bunch of shadowing, and I don't feel like I can capture all of that. So I'm just going to add a few strokes with my white gel pen around the edges to create some of that reflection and shadow-ish look to this. Here I add a little more black in between the silver to distinguish the two phases of gears in that head, and a little bit of the black around that center band, and that is going to do it for me with the details. Now I'm ready to start layering pieces together. I have one more die cut bowl, and so I'm not going to draw it. I'm just going to use what I have. It is too big for the scale of mixer that I made, so I'm going to adjust it. I will go ahead and draw in onto the background of this card with my pencil the shape of the mixer head, and then I will trace over that with the silver pen to give it more realism, and then I'm going to set the bowl off to the side. So this is where I use what I have and adjust my ideas and intentions to fit with my skills and my materials. The next thing I need to do is a stick of butter, again because that sits on top of the mixer. I need to do this as a separate piece so that I can glue it on top of the mixer instead of trying to draw on top of the mixer. And I am just using skills from elementary school drawing where we have straight parallel lines to create a box, and then we have one diagonal line connecting those to create the illusion of depth. The more you can keep your straight lines parallel with each other and your diagonal lines parallel with each other, the more realism you're going to get out of it. Now, if you notice, my left-hand diagonal line is shifted a little bit farther out than the other one. I'm going to correct some of this with my scissors because my scissors will flow in a nice straight line. So I'm just going to line them up on the line, make sure it's kind of straight, and then snip. Now I accidentally snipped in the middle of the butter, but that's not going to be a big deal. Moving on. So here's my line. I'm going to go ahead and just cut it straight and then use my scissors to make that diagonal nice and straight and my horizontal nice and straight. Now when I flip it over, I've lost all those lines, so I do have to add them back in. I will use some really light pencil work to try and make sure my lines are parallel, creating that little corner of the cube, and then I can trace it over with the pen. Now you should let that pen dry plenty of time so that it's not going to smear. I got a little impatient and I ended up erasing my pencil lines before the ink was totally dry, so it did kind of smear the ink a little bit, but that's okay. I did my best and it's gonna be fine in the end. All right, there it gets glued on top of my scene, and I'm creating more of 3-dimension with all of these pieces layered on top and next to each other. I am going to draw the flour and sugar sacks next. I'm using the same ideas that I used with the butter stick in terms of those parallel lines and diagonal lines, creating depth and dimension. This image is a little more complicated because it's not just a block, so you have some extra triangles. So look at all of the shapes. Think about the lines next to each other, parallel with each other, lines that are above and below each other, front and back to each other. So I'm just going with all of those pieces and looking at them line by line to see what I want to do. And then I did change up some things. I made my sugar bag more of a block, so that kept it simpler. I decided to skip the measuring spoons altogether and just drew in one measuring cup so I can adjust it to how much time and energy I want to put into it. Then again, I'm tracing all of the pencil lines with my pen and erasing those. One important thing that I do is after I draw with my pencil, I do erase it once first to get it as light as possible where I can still see before I trace it over with my pen. That way, once I am done with my pen work and let that dry, the erasing at that point isn't as much. And then I'm adding details in here with various markers and a little more pen work, a little more pen details. This is where I really think alcohol markers shine. Filling in this whole section with yellow with a regular water-based marker causes a streaky look to it. So this is where, if you want to dive into the world of alcohol markers, it could benefit you. All right. I am adding a little bit more distinction to the shadows of these white bags. If you just leave them stark white, they tend to blend in with the white background too much. So flicking in a very light gray color anywhere things touch or overlap will add a little bit of that depth of shadow. I will also trace in the baseline shadow of all of these objects so that it looks more like they're sitting on a surface instead of floating into space. The last thing I do is add some words by simplifying what is in the inspiration. I did trace it all out with my pencil first. You can see it better down there at the bottom. And then I can go over it with my markers and erase any remaining pencil lines after that. Do be aware that sometimes your marker would trap your pencil and you'll still be able to see it, but you can give it a try on scratch paper and see how it works. And with that, I am done with this drawing project. So there you have it. I hope you got some good tips and tricks to set about trying your own hand drawing or hand lettering, and that it doesn't have to be too scary. And remember, it's just paper. If it doesn't work out, you can recycle it and try again. It does take practice, and I am not an artist, but I love to call myself artful for this adventure of giving things a try and having some success some of the time. I will be back soon with more crafty videos for you, and until then, I hope you have an artful day.